Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again.
Shouting the battle cry of freedom.
We will rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain.
Shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah. Down with the traitors, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again. Shouting the battle cry of freedom.
All right, my name is Paul Glumas, and I've been active for 41 years with the political movement of Lyndon LaRouche. Today, in the late month of July 2015, we're looking at the guns of August emerging, and we're looking at Obama starting a war with Russia while Congress is out of session. Now, this war is coming about because the powers that run the world, who I'm going to be talking about, they have come to the end of their power because a new global system of nations is emerging around Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and many other nations around a new economic system for development. Now, what I'm going to describe to you is something that is extremely alien to what you might think. But we have in our midst, centered around the British monarchy, and around them, a group of aristocrats and oligarchs who have never forgiven Abraham Lincoln for the industrial transformation of the United States during the Civil War that the Union was not supposed to have won. And that industrial transformation was then spread to Germany and Japan and other places. And what the industrial transformation did is it increased the power of the average labor of one person and created the abundance so that you can bring whole sections not only of the population out of poverty, but also have the leisure to develop them educationally. That revolution, called the Industrial Revolution, is considered to be the greatest sin, the greatest mistake, the greatest horror of the modern world. And all efforts are being made to end the consequences of that industrial revolution by plunging the world into a primarily pre-industrial condition. This is why people like Schellenhuber, Palmer, Al Gore, all these people who are environmentalists as such, who are projects of this policy, believe that the carrying capacity of the earth was somewhere around 1 billion people. These people look at the world from the standpoint that 1 billion people is about the right threshold for a primarily pre-industrial world, a permanent equilibrium with nature. Now, how did this come about? Well, I'm going to talk about something called the Hideous Revolution, which was the first stage of this transformation. This transformation centers around the principal figure of Thomas Huxley and a person that Thomas Huxley was very close to, Charles Darwin. Now, the revolution that takes place is an attempt to change the very nature of the conception of man from that of a species which has a certain immortality because of its creativity, its ability to change its relationship to nature through increasing scientific discoveries, to merely being another animal, being merely a more perhaps developed animal, but nonetheless merely an animal. Now, at the time of Huxley and Darwin. We're talking about 1850s. The issue of the evolution of the planet and the evolution of life have become a major issue. Fossils have been found of species that no longer existed, and in this field of evolution, there were three individuals who had a very profound idea of evolution. One of them was Jacques Cuvier. The other one was Geoffroy, Etienne Geoffroy. The other one was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck, Geoffroy, and Cuvier. These were all Frenchmen contemporary to each other. They lived spanning the period at the late 1700s into the French Revolution and then into the first quarter of the 1800s. Now, they each took a different view of evolution. Cuvier was saying that because because all the organisms are so intricately connected, you can't have a change in one part of the organism without having to change all the other parts of the organism simultaneously. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Creation of new species or the creation of a change in the form of the organism could not occur unless all of the things were coordinated. And therefore, evolution changes in species, if that were possible, had to occur in a very in a complete way. You had to go from one to the next species or different species, but it had to be done in a coordinated way. Then came Geoffroy, who said, well, if you look at all the animals, they all seem to have a general pattern or an archetype. And then if you look at various living forms, particularly animal living forms, you see vestiges of organs that are no longer there. You have gigantism. You have all kinds of mallotropic things where animals can be born with two heads and different things. And so Geoffroy developed the idea that within that there is this potential for a change existing in the organism, but that change had certain boundaries. In other words, you couldn't change this proportion. You couldn't have there was a certain equilibrium in the ability to change. And then came Lamarck, who said, well, on a minor scale, the environment can change the hereditary characteristics of living forms. But life itself, the principle of life itself, is what creates the environment that creates further life, that opens the door for the coming into being of further life. In other words, as he put forward, most of the compounds on the earth are actually on the surface of the earth are actually products of living processes. They didn't come about through chemistry or physics. They came about through the action of life on the planet. And it's this living principle that transforms the physical non-living part, and that non-living part then is transformed, and then in the transformation and the creation of that new, it opens the door for new species from that standpoint. Now, all of these different theories was looking at things from a certain angle, but they were looking at things from a certain standpoint. Now, Darwin says that his inspiration for his theory of natural selection came from his reading of Parson Malthus, which is that, according to Malthus, living forms always have more, bear more offspring than is capable of surviving, and therefore there's a struggle within the living forms to see who was more fit to survive, to see what individual organism was more fit to survive, and that this was the basis for evolution. Now, when Darwin put this forward, he completely would not deal. No one, all the Darwinians, all the people who put Darwin's forward, they completely forgot about the other three issues that were raised by the other three individuals. Now, Huxley, who became the champion of Darwin and organized the revolution using Darwin's natural selection ideas, did not believe in Darwin. But in a letter to his closest associate, Hooker, who's the leading botanist of Great Britain, who was also Darwin's closest friend, he said, well, we're going to use Darwin's ideas to basically create a revolution. And sure enough, in 20 years, they had created a revolution. Both he, Hooker, Joseph Hooker, and Darwin had become members of had begun exchanging the chairmanship of the Royal Society, and they had a group of other people around them called the X Club, and one of them is famous for Spencer, Herbert Spencer. He's famous for social Darwinism, which became the most popular philosophy of Darwinian ideology in terms of the survival of the fittest in society. You know, if you're poor because of your genetic disposition, you're rich because you have better genes, and this grouping then laid the foundation for eugenics. And Darwin's first cousin, Dalton, claims his inspiration was Darwin to create the eugenics movement. And Dalton's Darwin's children, Leonard Darwin was the leader of the eugenics movement, and Darwin's Charles Galton Darwin, his grandchild, was the leader of the eugenics movement into the 50s and 60s. Eugenics movement is what Hitler was all about. Now, in Germany, they had Ernst Haeckel, who popularized Darwin's ideologies, and then what Huxley did is he did a book on the relationship of that apes and man had common ancestors, and that was the basis for promoting an ape theory of man. That man was basically just another animal, like with a common descendant from the apes. And what this did is that it completely obscured the nature of the difference between humans and animals. Because the very nature of the difference is what allows for humanity to have a population of 10 million in one period, and 100 million in another, and 1 billion in another, and 10 billion later on, through successive scientific revolutions in terms of the transformation of the economy, in terms of the transformation of relationships to the United States and to the rest of Europe. And their Darwinian view became the backbone of the identity of a lot of the population, a lot of the people in Western Europe and in North America. And that still prevails to this day. And this completely dovetailed with the racism of the Southern plantation system, but that didn't work because Lincoln crushed that. But you had a secondary racism emerged, centered around this, and then you had race science, which was very popular in the 1920s. It was as popular then as environmentalism is today, and the very founders of race science, their successors continued on in the creation of the environmentalist movement, primarily through such individuals as Huxley's grandson, Julian Huxley, who collaborated in creating the new Darwinian synthesis of the 1940s and 50s, which took Darwin to the molecular level, because there was never really any proof that you had a species change through natural selection. I mean, you never had any proof of that. In fact, they tried to create one called the Piltdown hoax, which lasted into the 50s, when it was no longer useful. But this is where they put a brain of where they put the cranium of a person next to the jaw of an ape, basically, and then they called it a great find. And everyone who was involved knew it was a hoax, and everyone who promoted it knew it was a hoax. But that's the kind of thing the British do. They like to promote hoaxes. So anyhow, so we had this hideous revolution in the sciences. Now, Huxley also became very big in the socialist movements and the working man's educational movements in the late 1800s. And he introduced his philosophical ideas into the socialist movement. He's also the founder of agnosticism, which is you have no way of knowing whether God exists or not. And only science has the right to make that decision, and there's no scientific proof. Therefore, you have no way of knowing. So basically, the idea was that if you're really a scientifically oriented person, you can't be religious. You can't believe in God. It's okay to believe in God. It's okay to do all of that, but it's not science. Science has nothing to do with theology or anything like that. Science is based on empiricism. Science is based on not on hypothesis, not on looking at things from the standpoint of what's causing them, but rather looking at things from the standpoint of empiricism. So the agnosticism was very important because it created a population of scientists and intellectuals who basically were not interested in no longer interested in fundamental issues about the nature of man or the nature of the universe or the nature of God, or determining whether God exists or not. And so you have essentially created in the culture a situation where religions were essentially cut off from science, and science was cut off from religion, from morality. So the whole thing is that morality was an issue of religion, and science was not an issue of morality. So they basically divorced issues of morality from issues of science. This is also part of the hideous revolution. And our modern day has been our modern world has been completely determined by this. And then in response to Huxley, you had the creationists. So you had the Darwinian view of the evolution, which is natural selection, survival of the fittest, and then you had the creationist view, which is that God created everything, and there was no such thing as evolution, or no such thing as things being able to develop to a higher stage, or to progress. So you got caught in these two different camps, and this was a way of controlling the debate, the issues, fundamentally. Today, if you go to a school and you don't subscribe to Darwin, you're a heretic. You might as well be a creationist or some freak. But there's nothing in Darwin which is scientific, which is causally connected. It's the mechanism of the survival of the fittest between individuals fighting it out, which determines evolution. Whereas in the other three predecessors on theory of evolution, they had different ideas. They had an idea of a different valid orientations to looking at evolution from a number of different standpoints. Whether they were right or wrong, they didn't leave it up to some mysterious survival mechanism, which somehow, you know, gives the winner take all kind of mentality, which is the way people think today in our culture. That is the most profound thing that's gone on in our culture, is the belief that, you know, the losers is winners and losers, and, you know, you got to fight to survive. You got to fight to, you know, be the top dog, and if you're not, you're a loser. That whole mentality, which has dominated our culture, is really sick, and it destroys the solidarity within the human species. It destroys the love of humanity, which is very important for people to have happiness and to make scientific discoveries, because you love the human race. You love the human race. You want to help. You want to develop. Oh, you're welcome to have your, you know, do-gooder mentality, but, you know, it's the struggle of the survival of the fittest. And this view also justify mass murder of Irish, mass murder of Indians, the mass murder of third world populations, the mass murder, the forced backwardness, slavery. It's all justified under a Darwinian kind of view of man. All of that is justified, you know, and the rule of the strong, all of that is justified under a Darwinian. Hitler is a quintessential Darwinian-oriented individual. So this is the hideous revolution, and we are still stuck in the hideous revolution, and our population has been severely damaged over over a long period of time by the hideous revolution that I'm describing. People don't even know where most of these ideas come from. Americans didn't think that way before the 1850s, before Darwin became popular, before Herbert Spencer promoted social Darwinism. Americans didn't think this way. They didn't think about each other this way. This is British. This is the British Empire, and Americans. Now, you did have slavery in the South, and this was definitely a complement to the slave system of the South, and its revival in different forms, different cultural forms in the post-slavery period. But outside of the Southern plantation slavery mentality, this was not America. This was not the American view of things. And then this whole Darwinian thing was morphed into the rugged individualism as part of the whole culture that emerged in the 1900s. And then with the Horatio Alger series of novels, you know, promoting this view in the 1920s, you had a whole society being misoriented in the most profound ugly sort of way. So now in the whole thing about Darwin's theory of natural selection is that even the guy who was the most profound promoter of it, the guy who was the organizer of it, the guy that was called the Pope of Darwinism, the guy who Darwin himself calls my bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley, he did not believe in Darwinism. He was enough of a scientist to know that there was nothing possibly true in Darwin's theories. That explains something to you. That explains that the whole thing was an operation to justify the depredations of an empire and to justify the enslavement of humanity. And that's what has been going on. Now there's a huge fight against that coming from the formerly developing nations who've had enough with colonialism. They've had enough with all of this, and they're forming a new system. They finally have formed a new system. The United States has at different times been on different sides of this issue. Under Lincoln, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, under Kennedy, They were against this. But for the most part, the U.S. has been in favor of it in historical time period. Whether it was the period when slavery was king, or the period um, in the 1920s before Roosevelt, or the current period with Bush and Obama. You have an entirely coherent conception of we have to be the top dog, and now that Russia, China, and India are working together in a new system, we have to crush it, and that means war. And we've come to a point where that war is very imminent. It's very, very imminent, because the financial system that we're in right now in the transatlantic region is not oriented towards human development. It's not oriented towards economic development. It's not oriented towards future development. It's a system that was programmed to collapse. And in the collapse of that system, the world was supposed to go through a proper reduction in population to 1 billion people, which is the perfect population that is desired. It's the level that is desired for for eco-friendly, or should I say oligarchically friendly, primarily pre-industrial society. And you'll hear Al Gore talk about the biggest mistake man made was industrialization. You'll hear all these people talk about this from that standpoint. And that's what they mean. And they have, in our country, they have created, brainwashed through the educational system, through mass propaganda. They've got an entire generation, several generations of people completely believing that human beings are evil, that they have essentially, they're destroying the planet, and that their economic development is the greatest sin on the planet. And we even got a pope who's gone along with this and with a new encyclical. But what does it mean? It means that if you can't have fossil fuels, and you can't go to nuclear and fusion, then what you're left with is supposedly these other technologies, which are very low density, and cannot support more than 1 billion people on the planet. They know that. That's why they designed it that way, that it cannot support more than 1 billion people. Solar, windmill, and all this other stuff cannot support, at best, more than 1 billion people. They know that. They designed it that way.
The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
Of the modern world. And all efforts are being made to end the consequences of that industrial revolution by plunging the world into a primarily pre-industrial condition. This is why people like Schellenhuber, Palmer, Al Gore, all these people who are environmentalists as such, who are projects of this policy, believe that the carrying capacity of the earth was somewhere around 1 billion people. These people look at the world from the standpoint that 1 billion people is about the right threshold for a primarily pre-industrial world, a permanent equilibrium with nature. Now, how did this come about? Well, I'm going to talk about something called the Hideous Revolution, which was the first stage of this transformation. This transformation centers around the principal figure of Thomas Huxley and a person that Thomas Huxley was very close to, Charles Darwin. Now, the revolution that takes place is an attempt to change the very nature of the conception of man from that of a species which has a certain immortality because of its creativity, its ability to change its relationship to nature through increasing scientific discoveries, to merely being another animal, being merely a more perhaps developed animal, but nonetheless merely an animal. Now, at the time of of
Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys. We'll rally once again.
Shouting the battle cry of freedom.
We will rally from the hillside. We'll gather from the plain.
Shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever. Hurrah, boys, hurrah. Down with the traitors. Up with the star. While we rally round the flag, boys. Rally once again. Shouting the battle cry of freedom.
All right, my name is Paul Glumas, and I've been active 41 years with the political movement of Lyndon LaRouche. Today, in the late month of July 2015, we're looking at the guns of August emerging, and we're looking at Obama starting a war with Russia while Congress is out of session. Now, this war is coming about because the powers that run the world, who I'm going to be talking about, they have come to the end of their power because a new global system of nations is emerging around Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and many other nations around a new economic system for development. Now, what I'm going to describe to you is something that is extremely alien to what you might think. But we have in our midst, centered around the British monarchy, and around them, a group of aristocrats and oligarchs who have never forgiven Abraham Lincoln for the industrial transformation of the United States during the Civil War that the Union was not supposed to have won. And that industrial transformation was then spread to Germany and Japan and other places. And what the industrial transformation did is it increased the power of the average labor of one person and created the abundance so that you can bring whole sections not only of the population out of poverty, but also have the leisure to develop them educationally. That revolution, called the Industrial Revolution, is considered to be the greatest sin, the greatest mistake, the greatest horror